So we have to define how the world should look like, which we want to come out of this transformation period. I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years. I think it's a role model for many countries, but I think also we should leave it to each country to make its own decision what system it wants to adopt. And I think we should be very careful in imposing systems. But the Chinese model is certainly a very attractive model for quite a number of countries.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start, investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about, of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, writing teacher Jessica, and community organizing socialist Kenny Cepeda. We're online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our blog in the episode notes. You can also find our personal social media handles as at Don Eduardo Barca and at ZepDKE on Instagram, and Jess's Twitter handle as at JHomie889. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. So today's topic, Andy, you had suggested that maybe we take a look at the China protests, and then thinking about it further, we had Jess and Kenny who's like, yeah, sure, let's do it because of what's happening there, and it might be significant given that we have discussed protests in the way that they should be against the state when you're being locked down, and especially when you're using a narrative in order to achieve some political power and to abuse that power. No, so if you can just give us a recap of what, or some summary of what's been going on, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah. So first off, I've tried to write down the names of the various provinces, and Beijing and Shanghai, I think I'm okay with saying, but I'm really, unfortunately, not going to try to pronounce other names of other provinces where I've heard that protests are going on. Merely to say, though, that in some ways, one of the significant things about these protests, there were these big protests in Hong Kong prior to the first lockdowns that China did, and in my opinion, those Hong Kong protests were in part what inspired China to go so dramatic in its COVID policies, in the same way that I could see the French government taking on the yellow vests using these COVID lockdowns. But what I would say is one major thing is that these protests that have taken place in response to zero COVID policy of China are much broader, are taking place in multiple provinces, in small towns as well as big cities. The other thing I'd say about it is first off, that the Chinese working class is no stranger to struggle, actually. I mean, people have this notion that people in China are all cowed, and that's definitely not true. It's definitely not true on the countryside. You can certainly hear stories in the past years where the Chinese government has had to face a lot of resistance to the kinds of changes that are taking place in their economy, which are sort of like what took place in the beginning of capitalism in Europe, where more and more work opportunities are being forced into the city. And in many ways, the possibilities of people having their own land is being more and more restricted in China. That kind of the enclosure process that was taking place in Britain. So a process like that is taking place in China, and it has met with a pretty stiff resistance in the countryside of China, although the Chinese ruling class has made progress on that. Secondly, the level of strikes in the cities are much higher in China than they are in the United States. And that was true in the last 10 to 20 years. Now, the United States is a historic low, but if you think in the United States that we do have a legacy of resistance within our working class, but if people in the United States saying, well, if people in China don't fight back, when you're pointing the finger at China, three fingers are pointing back at us. We are the ones right now who have lost any connection to our legacy of struggle. The Chinese working class has actually put forward much more resistance, even in the cities, in response to certain acts of corporations and things like that. Now, what's significant, though, is you won't see much in China, or at least I haven't heard much in relationship to taking on issues like state issues and political issues of that sort. And so that's what's significant to me about these things. And also, it's important to remember that this is not just like only a few months ago, there were massive demonstrations in specific provinces in response to bank malfeasance that was taking place in China, as well as just before this, there was the Foxconn stuff going on, where Foxconn was telling its workers, basically that they weren't locking down enough in COVID. And so that some workers left. And then when they hired new workers, those workers weren't getting paid what they were told. And so there were pretty big pitched battles between Foxconn and those workers. And so all this stuff is sort of going on. And some of the pictures you've seen have not actually been COVID zero policies, but have been pictures of people fighting cops or like fighting somebody in these big hazmats over some of the Foxconn stuff. And that's not actually in relationship to COVID zero. But nevertheless, I think what's taking place there is significant. Of course, for me, the idea that the working class is an international class, all of us have talked about how we believe in open borders. And when workers struggle against their state in one area, it helps us in all areas. And so I believe it's significant. And we can talk also then about how much the U.S. is trying to get a hand in, things like that. That might be part of our discussion. Also, I want to say that the initial detonator for this was the fact, or at least I was told, or I've heard it's the fact that there was a fire in one of the provinces in relationship to COVID lockdown policies, where they were penned in the place, like what happened like very famously in this country in a textile mill in the 20s, where workers were locked in and many people kind of burned to death because they couldn't get out and fire folks couldn't get to them. And so that, I don't know if that story is entirely true. I've heard other accounts of that, but that seems to be the detonator for a broad set of response to people saying there's too much quarantine camps, there's too much testing. It's like daily testing, massive quarantine camps. I can show you some video on some of that stuff. I mean, the level of control of China is, well, I believe makes the US ruling class salivate, and it makes them jealous. I'm pretty sure they hope on doing the same. I think some would say that there's a united plan by the US ruling class and Chinese ruling class. Again, that's not my view. But what the Chinese ruling class is doing in China has definitely gotten a response from the Chinese workers. It should be welcomed. I think to the extent that they have pushed back, I think it is causing China to pause. I also think that the Chinese ruling class pause will give them, looks like, breathing time to figure out how they're going to come back around and crack down. I'm pretty convinced of that. But nevertheless, when workers protest anywhere and fight back against their state, it should be supported by workers everywhere. And that's kind of my first statement about this.
I want to add something. So this year we've seen video footage of drones in Shanghai hovering over people's edifices and talking about, and I have it quoted here, which is very scary, the things that it's saying. It's telling people to stop singing because they were on their balcony singing. Of course, there's the topic of isolation, and saying things like, we're gonna include a clip of it here.
好了，终于来外头，所有人都在叫，要命了！就刚刚5分钟前头，叫还没几个了，现在突然之间，所有人都叫了，要死！
久离家园的居民朋友们，在疫情封控期间，请严格遵守市政府相关防疫规定，共 指灵魂对自由的渴望。不要开窗歌唱，此行为有一挺传播的。
But talking about stay inside and to comply and to curb your soul's desire for freedom. I mean, this is something we brought up in one of the episodes before, but it is really bad, and this is why I think that people are getting sick of it. And they're fighting against this protest. They're fighting against this lockdown confinement. Sorry. I just wanted to add that it's like so much of it's been very draconian.
Here's stuff I found. This was from Redacted. They had some videos that they showed. So these are camps that they were showing that have been constructed. They're like totally cookie cutter camps that over and over and over again the same thing. This is just looking inside of one of the camps. And then they're going to show an outer view, like this is these camps, and they're continuing to construct them. So this just shows the scope of these quarantine camps that are being built. From what I hear, they are actually more being used on the countryside than within the cities, although they are being used somewhat in the cities. But people in the countryside are being herded more into these than the cities. So this is showing just one dude basically herding all these people, and all these people have like luggage. I mean, this looks to me like the Japanese internment kind of stuff. It looks to me like a large mass of people being interned. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And it's pretty chilling. And I just think people should look at this not as like, oh, what's happening in China. It's happened in Australia. It's happened in Canada. And it's being talked about in the United States. So
Andy, do we know, I'm not familiar with this website, but these are people being herded into a quarantine camp for COVID?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they supposedly have to pay, like to go there. Oh, and so I wanted to show you these drones.
Because they've tested positive, or just
yes, because they test positive. Okay. They test positive. It's not contact tracing there. These are, from what I hear, these are people that test positive. Now, people test daily in China, like every day they test, and they show some the stuff on like their QR code. I had that. So you test daily, and then if your phone says red, like it says here, then pretty much anywhere you want to go, it's going to say, nah, you can't go. And that's the situation for sure in the city. I don't know how much it's true in the countryside. I mean, how much it's spread there in the countryside. But this was really crazy to me. The other thing, which not just drones, I'll finish this whole thing. These are drones spraying cities in the, like, supposedly in relationship to COVID. And they're just spraying the cities. Like you can see spray coming out of them. And I want to show you one more other drone thing, which I found really crazy. It'll be coming up in a second. So this is a drone where if you got to scan your QR code from your car to be able to advance. So you've got to be able to get your phone to let you get past that drone, which is holding up a QR code. If you can't do that, then you get flagged for going beyond a point. It's not like your car gets stopped. That will be another day when we are working through phones, like when we have the Internet of Things really fully connected. They could literally force your car to stop and turn your car off. But at the very least, they have something which says, here's a drone holding up a QR code. Make sure your phone lets you get through this. And again, all these things are not, I don't show, or we should not just think of this as China. We should think of this as foreshadowing for our future.
Right. And this is a discussion I've had with a family member of mine this August when I was in Mexico, and I was at a centro comercial, at a mall, and there was like they were selling crepes and all this, and I was asking for the menu, and then there was a QR code, and I asked for the physical menu, and my uncle was like, "Why are you always being so difficult? Why is it like you are like, why can't you just get on with the program?" Like, hold on, get on with the program. Do you know what that means, or what are you saying? It's like, why is everything a challenge, Eduardo? Why is why is this so difficult for like these workers? They don't have any fault. Like you making it so difficult for them to find this menu, for them to read out loud from their phone what they have because you don't want to scan this and he's like, why don't you just scan it? And I say, the thing is, it's like I don't want to contribute to more. I know that I already have a digital footprint, but I'm just trying to resist in the areas and pockets of areas. Like, for example, we shouldn't allow for us as customers to give into these QR codes at every restaurant, at every place that we go to. And he is just like, we had this back and forth. You're showing this QR code above vehicles. It's like to normalize the QR code at a restaurant is that's the way this is the next step, right? It's like you go from menu to entrance to suddenly being stopped in the car, and then it's going to be everywhere. Like if we normalize it everywhere. So I understand that my uncle that may not have that his intentions aren't trying to get us all set up into this virtual space, but it's beyond that, right? Like we have to be able to we have to think about where is this leading to, especially with what you just showed us in that video.
Yeah, story of my life. Just do it. Just wear the mask. Just what's the big
Yeah,
deal? Just
yeah.
QR code.
And here's what they will say when it happens. They'll say, well, we already do our QR code at the restaurant. What's the big deal if that's how they do it. First, they tell you don't complain about the restaurant. And then when you complain about the one that the QR code that's stopping you on the highway, it's like, well, how different is it from the restaurant that lets you in? Like they've already
I just heard that exact argument in meeting like at my university where like people were actually, oh my God, bringing up like student security in terms of data. And like the person leading the meeting was like, they kind of got frustrated after a couple of minutes of pushback and literally went and like grabbed his phone and was like, we're all like selling our stuff. Like it's just so frustrating. I wanted to say too though, I don't know. I just have a really hard time, especially with China in particular, figuring out what media coverage or just independent journalism or whatever, like what's real and what's not, and what's real but like out of context. I just, I mean, basically since going all the way back to the beginning of this whole, alleged pandemic and those bizarre videos of people falling down in the street, it just feels like there's so much mystery and performative weird stuff, and I don't trust anybody on the left, right, or in between in this country to cover anything but China in particularly, like without an agenda. And so like I don't know, like, and you were like, oh, like read whatever for this episode, and I don't really feel like independent media has been covering the Chinese protests a whole lot. Maybe that's just like the people I follow a little bit, but not that much. And it's one of those things where like I don't know of journalists on the ground, because obviously over there, and this is part of what makes the protests so impressive, is that it is a huge risk to protest in that country. I mean, I was asking my partner's kind of opinion or like perspective, because he lived in China for a few years. And I was like what do you think? Like what realistically happens? Like if you walk into the street and you say down with the CCP or something. And he's like, you could get shot. Like you could straight up get shot. Like that is the reality, at least according to some people. So it's a big deal. I mean, the people who have been protesting are taking on a lot more risk than those of us who are protesting in the United States, and we were, pretty pitiful, honestly, on the whole, in terms of numbers and active resistance, protest wise. So yeah, I mean, I don't doubt, like, obviously all the QR stuff, like China is a leader in, I mean, they're overtly, saying, yes, we are going to be a leader in this fourth industrial revolution, QR codes and, testing in the medical field and all of it for sure. Another aspect I just wanted to bring into it is the US media response, which, like, I'm not talking about independent journalism, which, like I said, I don't really feel like there's been a ton of coverage, but mainstream media in the US has been largely supportive. Like, I've seen these articles about young Chinese people like fighting for their freedom, and like, has China gone too far with these lockdowns? As if people burning alive inside their fucking buildings locked in is not, I mean, it's like, okay. But yeah, I mean, that's just been really gross to watch. And it's, I mean, of course, like, China bad guy, right? As if the US didn't lock down their people or shut down their schools or tell people to effectively, like, just shut themselves inside their homes for 2 to 3 years. And they're starting to do it again. I mean, I told you guys earlier today, like, Oregon just declared another state of emergency for, public health yesterday. So crazy. Well, maybe I'll leave it there. I have a couple more thoughts, but
I just
Can oh
I just wanted to follow on that, or I shared that cautious approach that you have, Jessica, because obviously the stories that we hear here are so, it's hard to get a confirmation, right? What's going on the ground there? We don't know people there personally. When my first kind of like jump into organizing like more like in depth was Nicaragua, when shit was going down in Nicaragua, and I had people there that I could talk about, what was going on. And even then, the facts were hard to really put together, because there is exaggeration on both sides, and but at the same time, it's the U.S. coverage, it's like, pointing the finger like they did with North Korea, with Cuba, with Venezuela. Look, this could be like that, like, we're not as bad as those people. And and now people are this communist country, people are standing up for their freedom. That's basically the narrative that I'm hearing now. And the scary part is actually, to me, not that what China is doing, because they're doing their own version of shit. It's the fact that here, by and large, we don't realize the same shit has happened to us. It's happening to us, and in fact, we're not fighting back because we're not aware that we have an enemy here. It's for our own good. Because just like in Nicaragua, people fucking knew that the elections were rigged every fucking year. So most people didn't vote, and the same government won. And everyone knew that the dead would vote. I was fucking asked to vote, even though I was not a citizen of the country, like casually. And so everyone knew the elections were a joke. And when push came to shove, fucking people rose up and, and tried to get this government now. And so now this government is ruling by pure force. But that's when the veil of deceit is it's like uncovered. But we're not even close to that in this country. Because the narrative again is that China went too far. And yes, some people are reconsidering what the fuck happened here, but that they're going far. And it's almost automatic that people assume that China is the worst case, and also I think it's a mistake to think that we're going to head to what's happening in China on the same road. Because I think that's the big mistake. Like we're gonna head there because the interests that are pushing for this world order, this way of data mining, this way of social control, are the same interests. But China's just doing it differently than we are, and I think it's more insidious for us because we don't even know. It's like you said, out of convenience. I was a person who created the QR codes for my restaurant when the fucking pandemic happened. Before I knew all this, and it takes a lot to learn all this. You can tell some people, but we sound crazy now, because for most people, it's just convenience, right? Going to school online, it's just convenient now. There's not a lot of resistance because at least a lot of people that I know want to go to school online because it's convenient. I mean, because other parts of their lives are shit, and so they think this is a solution when in fact it's not. We know that. But it is that's the worst part. It's out of convenience that is being shoved into our face in some ways, right? There's also there is some mandates. There's some people that oppose this shit, but by and large, I don't think we're even close to being aware, of the massive repercussions that it has. And I think, in fact, thinking of China as the worst case, it's actually a distraction. And I guess that we can go more into that. But to me, just falling into that trap that China is the worst case and look, this is how it could be, leads us to accept shit that doesn't look as bad.
So I'm not sure I understand what both of you were saying in terms of focusing on China as, to me, it's very important to focus on China as where it's going, because the ruling classes, the capitalist class, copies off of each other. That's what they do. That's what they do in their business, and that's what they do politically, and that's, in my opinion, that's what they've done in regards to COVID. When someone's got something, when somebody's figured something out, then everyone else tries to catch up with those efficiencies. Those are generally economic efficiencies and technologies that are copied, but they are also copy political trends. Just like Germany today had a big article about how there was a coup by the right wing to take down their government. That looks very much like a January 6th story to try to prop up their government. Where did they get that from? They got it from our government just last 2 years. Secondly, I want to parse out mainstream media versus so-called independent media, because I do think there's a difference in what mainstream media in the United States' first response to this was silence. The reason there was silence, it took them, we're 2 weeks late to this party, folks, 2.5 weeks. The first thing mainstream media said was nothing. And the reason that is because the Democratic Party said nothing and the Republican Party said nothing. It took the ruling class in this country about a week to figure out what to say. And Anthony Blinken just came out and said it, the condensed version, which is what Trudeau is saying and things like that, which is, oh, of course we support people's right to speech. That's not good what they're doing. But he also said, we can't really speak to what China's doing. He said, we just hope that we want China to get COVID right. Now, why is he saying that? He's saying that because he knows that they have every intention of having to exert the same control on their working class that they see China doing in there. So they don't feel completely comfortable saying, hey, oppose this at all costs, in the way that they have full-throated lying in support of everything Ukraine is doing compared to Russia, right? Here, when it has to do with the China cracking down on its own people, they want to be a little bit more reserved, all right? And it has nothing to do with, in my opinion, with the fact that they don't understand that China is their main political enemy. I believe when we get to that defense strategy document, we're going to see that all roads in the terms of the competition, in my opinion, are about US and China, and they understand that, and that Russia is actually a bit player in that global competition. So the mainstream media's first response and general response has been, wait a second, when left people or liberal people have come out and been supportive of some of the demonstrations, people have been attacked or at least been criticized for saying, hey, wait a second, China needs to be able to do something to keep people safe. And the reason people are saying that is because that's what the left and the liberal media has been saying. So they were struggling to find their voice in relationship to policies that we ourselves largely followed. And now they're trying to
waiting to see what the Chinese government did.
They're waiting to see what the Democratic Party is going to say. They're waiting for Joe Biden, because Joe Biden wasn't saying anything. And Joe Biden wasn't saying anything because the U.S. hadn't figured out what they were going to say. It took a while. Our media is a mouthpiece of the security state. So it took a while for the U.S. capitalist class to figure out what exactly to say about this. And I do believe now they are now got their fingers more in and now have operatives trying to figure out how they can put pressure on it to make the Chinese to give problems to the Chinese ruling class. But at the same time, they don't want this I personally don't think they want this to go too far, because they don't want anybody getting the wrong idea that this is the kind of opposition we should have in this country. And if you look and you listen to what on the Republican side and the Democratic side, and again, Anthony Blinken said it 3 days ago, very reserved criticism, very mild criticism, and mostly just saying, we want China to get COVID right. It's better for the entire world if they get COVID right. And that means he's accepting quarantine camps, he's accepting QR codes, he's accepting daily contact tracing and daily PCR tests, which have been pulled back slightly from daily to now weekly or bi-weekly or something like that. So I think that I take my lead, and I agree with you, Jessica. It's hard to know exactly what's going on, but part of my read on why I felt like this was significant was to see how much hand-wringing there was, or how much hesitancy there was on the part of our own ruling class to say anything. And Trudeau, he kind of finally came out and said, and it was obvious that then he had to kind of say, well, why is it okay for the Chinese to protest, the Chinese people to protest, and why did you have to smash the Canadian truckers? He got a few of those questions, and he tried to say, well, that was different. That was actually stopping the government. Those folks aren't trying to stop the government, which I kind of agree with him on that.
Any response to that?
So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I no doubt, agree that those technologies, those methods are coming our way. But I think that by feeding this notion that China, the Chinese state, right, is it's more evil. That notion in itself, like we're getting to that same place, but through quote unquote free enterprise. That we know it's an illusion, right? We know that Elon Musk is deep with the fucking state. We know that YouTube is deep with the state. Facebook is deep with the U.S. state. And I agree, this is part of this competition. My problem is that when it's out of context, that just feeding that narrative that China is more evil, that's the part that I think is very dangerous, and it actually is counterproductive in understanding our own situation here. That it's not that we're heading there, absolutely, but it's not even going to look exactly the same. I don't think it will. I think it will have its own forms, even though the exact same mechanisms are behind it. I think people will react if the U.S. state just try to impose more QR codes. There was some sort of resistance actually, but it's coming along not because of the state imposition, but because of private enterprise, like my restaurant and me thinking that was convenient. I don't know if I'm making a distinction there, but to me there's a difference between this narrative that is the Chinese state versus our state is not involved here.
And Jessica, is it all right if I just respond to one part to clarify what I'm trying to say? So I'm not saying that the Chinese ruling class is more evil. I'm saying that it's playing a better game at capitalism than the U.S. ruling class. And so what I'm saying is they're doing capitalism better than our ruling class, and our ruling class knows it. And so we have, in the same way that Europe had to follow the U.S. ruling class, the Americanization, the American model being imposed by the European ruling class in Europe over the last 30 years was largely the European ruling class knowing that they're getting their lunch eaten by the U.S. capitalists, so they have to figure out how to smash their workers here. That is what is happening in China. China is winning. China's not evil. China is winning. They're doing a better job smashing their workers. They've advanced more in the data collection. They've advanced more in QR codes. They've advanced more in the restrictions and geofencing. And so because of that, they are in a better position to compete globally, to gobble up all the resources. The U.S. ruling class knows that. That's what I'm saying. And so we have to understand that that's the competition, is to see who can get better at that. So it is a race to the top for them, but it's a race to the bottom for us.
And that to me is that is a conversation, and again, because this is the framework of understanding the world through competition, right? And these are not friends. These are, and this is where the answer I would have with someone who thinks that these people are colluding, right? Or they're planning together, is not. They are heading towards the same goal because they want, they have the same goal. They have the goal of winning. And so it will look different, at least in my eyes. It will look different, but towards the same goal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess all I was trying to say, and I get that you're not arguing that China's worse, and I feel like we always preach on here take care of your own government first before criticizing someone else's, which I stand by that for sure. Especially when you really can't even 100% figure out like what's going on. But I mean, I hear you, just going back to the media response thing, that it took them a minute. And like the US media response of sort of very temperately being like, yeah, like go protest it, like go Chinese protesters, like, ooh, freedom of speech. Like, it's not like they were going out on a limb doing that. Like, as brave as I think these Chinese protesters are, I don't think this is like the revolution. I don't think that they're going to, they have succeeded, I guess you could argue, because I do believe in the past week or so, China has pulled back a little bit on some of those policies, the zero COVID. That's what it's called, right? Zero COVID.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't think, don't kid yourself. Like the whole project is going ahead full steam. And I agree, like it's a race to the top. Who can win? I guess all I was trying to highlight by sort of talking about skepticism with regard to, especially like video footage coming out like that. I don't know, that video with all the people in the suitcases and stuff being like herded. Like, I mean, my immediate reaction is like, oh my God, horrific, right? Like, but I don't know. I mean, I think some of those videos they feed, whether or not they're real, either way, they feed straight into a Western narrative that makes the US policy look middle of the road and temperate. Oh, well, yeah, it's bad, Eduardo, that you have to ask for a physical menu, but like, come on, compare that to like what's going on in China. And I see that so frequently, like in the sort of media space, and it just, to me, it's very detrimental to focus and strategy, and even thinking about, this is kind of going a different direction, so interrupt me if I don't know if people have responses and stuff, but just thinking about strategies of resistance in general, and protest being only one form of resistance to the state. And I'm even thinking about what you said at the beginning, Andy, about like rural areas, and that's, I mean, obviously from like a personal angle, that's been a theme I've been thinking about a lot over the past year, and thinking about the different resistance movements that we've seen, the Indian farmers, right? Multiple occasions the past couple of years of like in association with anti-lockdown protests, but also yellow vest movements, right? Like French farmers coming into the cities from the countryside and literally like dumping animal shit right on government buildings. Amazing, love it. I'm just thinking about forms of resistance and how important those rural areas are, because you usually do see the big protests and the sort of like mass mobilizations in the cities. But when we think about who's growing the food, who's raising the livestock, who's creating medicine, like real medicine, plant medicine, right? Like those are other forms of power. And I'm thinking about what's happening in the Netherlands right now, in comparison, where you have the government coming down hard on farmers, on small farmers, right? Which is like a totally different, it's a different form of state violence, right? As opposed to like locking people in their home under the guise of a public health measure. But when we think about like sort of what that says about who has power, and then like how effective are these protests really being, right? And like what, like whether it's a distraction or like what does it do for us in terms of feeding or like shepherding, let's say in our case, Americans, right, into sort of mode of resistance where we're like, yeah, look at all those like Chinese people protesting their horrible communist government, right? like we should go do the same. And it's only a matter of years before like the drones come for us, like you're saying, right? Like it's not different. So I don't know, like I don't really have an argument here that I'm building to, but it's just making me think about like the forms of resistance and which ones are authentic and which ones are more like really more powerful in terms of fighting this thing. Because I feel like we're losing thus far. Like we're losing. You're on mute, Andy.
Oh, sorry. I agree, and I think the Chinese workers are losing as well. They made a push, but there's many pieces of evidence that tell me that the Chinese ruling class is going to reduce some restrictions and come back in a new way. And the biggest thing that tells me that these are not demonstrations that are going to truly challenge is how much people are masked. Like, I just don't think any demonstrations that show up with people with masks has already basically people have decided I'm subservient to the state that I'm opposing. And if you take that position, you're not a threat. And just one other thing is, I agree with you. Like, I understand how the optics of watching hundreds of people being shepherded into a quarantine camp might seem so sheepish. But let's be clear. Hundreds of thousands of people in the United States were shepherded into vaccination centers. And tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands, were kicked out of their jobs. And they took it pretty easy. And I'm not talking about people who basically agreed to the vax. I'm talking about people who didn't agree to it, but ultimately, well, I have to do it, you know? And so everyone has been shepherded, with carrying luggage or not, into going along with what's been done, and particularly here in the United States. I mean, Kenny certainly has told story after story of people who said, I don't want to do it, but it seems like I got to, if I'm going to keep my job, So that's one form of people carrying their luggage going into the camp. And then there's the other folks who basically, you know, like myself, ultimately, where I was not able to be part of a rally to push back against those things. I'm like, I'm out. Bye. Gonna go. You know, we all basically had to carry our luggage somewhere. We didn't put up a fight.
And I think what you're saying is the important part here. You know, to show like the parallels, right? Like that's what I mean. That it doesn't look the same, but you know, we are caught in the game. You know, like. And they have to do things to win, to play that game, you know. And the name of the game right now is data mining. The name of the game right now is compliance. The name of the game, you know, is technology. The name of the game is you know, like, it's all that, you know, like, it's ultimately, to me, like my frame of mind is they're capitalists, they're better, you know. This is why I disagree with a lot of leftists who defend China, you know, and are still caught in this, you know, COVID narrative. You know, like one of the questions I ask myself is is China, you know, because in the past, the US has been very good at pushing any sort of revolutionary attempts on their heels. And so, for example, in Nicaragua, right? When Nicaragua's revolution happened, the US forced them to spend money, to steer money away from the social projects and put the money into the defense, you know. So I ask myself, is China afraid? Is that why they're pushing this COVID thing? You know, and I'm wondering, what the hell are they afraid of? You know, like, of course the US, you know, is the big bully. But it just doesn't add up. Everything leads back to, you know, the COVID narrative being useful for, you know, again, hurting people and creating this mass level of compliance. And anyone who thinks that the Chinese are more compliant than we are is fucking kidding themselves, because, you know, like you just spoke to it, you know, like to this day, there's still people, you know, just caught in this psychosis, you know, that was created through the narratives. You know, and by the same token, if you think that the Germans were crazy and stupid, you're crazy and stupid, because you don't realize how we were brainwashed. Just like, you know, the people that have done horrible shit. And I think that's where the important part, you know, to show these parallels, you know, to steer away from this simple narrative that China is just really bad, you know, in like, but it's like to depict, to show how it is that no, we're doing a similar shit, and we're heading in a similar direction for the same goal. And for example, like to bring back the robots, the drones, fucking San Francisco's having discussions right now.
I was just going there.
Please use robots.
It's not the discussion's over. They voted on it.
I didn't even know. So what happened?
They voted overwhelmingly to support. Well, Eduardo, you haven't spoken. Maybe you can say something about what happened in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, here we are talking about, Andy, one of the episodes in the past you had showed us in New York, they had RoboDog, right? Then we see the RoboDog being used in China, and people are criticizing for it. And then we have San Francisco. The SFPD is actually they do have robots, but it became such a controversial thing where I'm at here in San Francisco that the supervisors had to put a brake on it. However, that brake for using robots for deadly force. Even though they put a brake on it, it's still being sent. The issue is being sent back to a committee for further discussion and could allow for it in limited cases in another time. So it's not completely eradicated. It's not completely going to go away in San Francisco. This was being done by SFPD, but then because of the backlash, they had to stop it. They put a brake on it. So it's still there. And they do have, I think, like 12 robots or something, where they still have them not being in use, but they still have them for when they're ready to be using, when they're ready to go and use them. I think for me, the most interesting thing about this conversation as we're talking is if you just do a search on a search engine about COVID and the Chinese, how the Chinese were praised during 2020, you'll see many articles on Nature magazine. I have it here, from CNN, from Nature magazine, from Science.org, from the Washington Post. I can see them here. They're saying government response to COVID-19 praised by the WHO. What the coronavirus response can teach us, and from what China's coronavirus response can teach us, can teach the rest of the world. China's aggressive measures have slowed the coronavirus. What 25 days changed the world. It's like praise after praise. This is 2020. Everyone's praising, and this is mostly the left. I even have people, friends, or I don't know if we're friends or not because they don't talk to me. I have people that I know who are part of the Party for Socialism, and these are other socialists, your fellow peeps over there. This is what happens with socialists. The newspaper of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, this is saying that China's response to the global pandemic, right, quote unquote, Jeff, there you go, those quotes. The global pandemic is being praised by the socialist of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And Professor Richard Wolff, which Kenny and I, we've mentioned him in an episode before, discusses how China has succeeded and the USA failed to beat COVID. If we look further, I'm looking here at Liberation News. Every criticism that is being targeted towards China, which I do think it's unfair because it's not just China. It was also New Zealand, by the way, and Australia that had very strict lockdowns, and all the attention and attacks are going to China. I mean, Jess had mentioned it about Australia.
Italy too. Italy was very tough on this stuff.
Right. But I think the most military force that I saw from like the most northern Western countries, I thought was, correct me if I'm wrong, from Australia, right? I just saw the footage and that was amazing. So here, Liberation News, they're saying here that we should look at China as the most successful in beating COVID. And they say here, everything that they did, they said no country has enough equipment supplies to meet the major pandemic to contain. Yet China, once it was clear how serious the crisis was, China acted immediately. China used a centralized database as if that's good. And they called to the population as a whole to quickly isolate, identify, sequence, and take public action following the international public health epidemic guidelines. This is the praise that they were being given. Suddenly, protests are happening, and then all of a sudden the left is like, oh yeah, we should be supporting them. You supported the lockdowns when they happened. I don't understand you. Are you for it or are you against it? Suddenly, you were so supportive and praising them for the longest time. Nature.org is saying what China can teach us, and suddenly you're saying the reverse. Who understands these people? So that's what I wanted to share. Now going to this robot thing. So then the drones are being used over there, and it's like, oh well, that's what China's doing over there. But here in SF, as Kenny brought up, we're considering having drones, robots using lethal force in the USA, in this country, in SF, where I'm currently living at, where both of you abandoned me. So here we are having the discussion criticizing China, and that's fine, but we should also be criticizing this country. And that's what I'm really concerned about. And Alison mentioned it in one of her episodes. So I hope that this message, this olive leaf, gets over there, and our message gets to Alison that she should come here and discuss that, because she discussed it in one of her episodes.
Well, you're talking about robots, right? And of course, there's robots. There's also AI. There's also cameras. Like San Francisco, for example, was caught using the footage from those automated cars, that are roaming around the city. San Francisco is infested with those cities, and I'm glad I don't fucking see them anymore. That they can use that footage for criminal cases. Guess what? Those Bing cameras that you think that, are keeping you safe, they're recording all your shit, and the shit of your people. Now for applying to a job, because I've been applying to jobs a lot, they want your fucking social media information. They ask for it right now willingly. But who's stopping them? Do you read all the fucking, private notices, do you read all that? Because you give away your life, because they might be looking into your fucking social media without you asking. And also, this whole notion of legality and that China is imposing shit. Fuck you. I'm sorry, but this whole register giving undocumented people licenses. They absolutely use the databases, of the DMV to track people. That and I mentioned this in another episode, that the shit is illegal doesn't mean they don't use it. Talk to fucking Edward Snowden, right? And how much data the NSA, they could go into your home. They have people's audios and videos. It's just a matter of someone wanting to look for it. And guess what? AI is going to be very efficient at looking for shit. And so it's not even about like from today. It's about the shit that you did about 5 years ago. And so this shit will be in your history. Even as we speak of the future, this shit is already out there. Like, a lot of our information.
Totally agree. But I will say, I don't know if you guys saw just your mention of the DMV. Kenny made me think of this, that I saw that the Real ID thing has been pushed back again, which I think is kind of interesting, maybe encouraging. I don't know. I know, like because I moved states last year, I had to get a new driver's license, and they were so pushy when I was like, no, I don't want that. I don't want that. No, thank you.
I may have an answer for that. And where it comes to mind is that right now I read the fucking financial news all the time to see what the hell they're saying. And they're saying that the reason inflation, it's a problem, is because we don't have enough immigrant workers. And so that's one element. If immigrant workers are not able to move, then, you can't exploit people.
But
I'm not that inspired by their real ID hesitancy, because it's like the hesitancy that the pushing back of Newsom on pushing back dates for vaccine. You have to do it in the schools. I think they keep giving themselves a little bit more space until they can close the whole trap. And that's all they're doing. Like at this point, even when they put out Real ID, or even when they put out some ID things on the airports, they still basically keep it open that people can use passports. They recognize they haven't fully built the net yet. And so I just feel they're biding their time. So
although they don't even, based on my experience this summer, like when I came back into the country, they didn't even ask for my country or for my passport. They just scanned my face. And that was literally it.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Nothing else. No paperwork. No.
And I just wanted to add that again, is this whole notion San Francisco illegalized or whatever the fuck made facial recognition, but its airport was one of the first ones to implement that.
Yeah. So it's rolling ahead. One other thing, I haven't really thought through this, but I was listening to, I can't remember who was playing it, but they were playing a mainstream media link of Fareed Zakaria. What is he, like CNN, I think? Or I don't know. They're all the same. One of the mainstream media outlets covering the Chinese protests. And one thing, I mean, he was kind of like asking the same questions we've been bringing up of like, is China, have they gone too far? And blah, blah, like this faux freedom of speech support. But he brought up the fact, he was like, well, ultimately, China's probably going to be bringing out their own mRNA vaccine, right, in the very near future, because what is it, Sinovac or something, right? Like that one's not actually mRNA. And over in the West, right, the mRNA ones have basically won the capitalist battle, right? Like Johnson & Johnson was kind of pushed aside at a certain point. And so his like ultimate response to the protest was like, well, eventually they're going to bring out their own mRNA. They're going to vaccinate their whole population, which is like, I don't know. How compliant is their population when it comes to these public health measures? Like, I agree with you, Andy, about like, there is a long history of like actual working class resistance. I think that's painted over a lot of times in coverage. At the same time, it is a culture of masking and WeChat, right? So not saying it's worse than here. It's just everywhere. People are being really, really compliant everywhere for the most part. So his argument was basically like, well, they're going to vaccinate all their population and then it's not going to be a problem, because if they vaccinate their whole population, then obviously there will be no COVID. And it's just right back into the fucking public health, mRNA technology, capitalist battle for who can make the most vaccine and get the most uptake. And I'm not saying that that's like the whole thing, but I just think it's telling that that's like where he took it from. Like, yeah, like good on you, good protesters, like well done. But like ultimately, like the thing that's really going to solve this is a jab.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned Antony Blinken's talking point of we all be critical of China, and we want China, like we expect China to be more permissive of protests and things like that and people's free speech. But when Antony Blinken says we want China to succeed, he's basically recognizing that everyone's got to get vaxxed, and we're all doing that to our own population. China actually, I know the Chinese Communist Party has complained about the level of vaccination in China, but I think the largest opposition is again on that countryside, and so that's a problem for them. And I would agree with Fareed Zakaria that that's how the Chinese rulers look at it, is get everyone into the ball game, because getting everyone vaxxed is getting everyone on the QR code and getting everyone with the phone that they can control their motion. And they have a much tighter control in the cities than they do in the countryside, and that is a problem for them. And that is the hope, I believe, is the resistance in the countryside.
Yeah, I just wanted to add really briefly, like in those rural areas, based on my very limited knowledge, but I do have like some indirect connections. Chinese medicine is still very much practiced, especially among some of the older generations, like millennial and down, like not so much. But I think it's interesting, and I don't know how much that has to do with those who maybe haven't, like in the rural areas, how the uptake is not as high. I mean, part of that I think is just the nature of cities, right? Like it's the same pattern here, same pattern pretty much everywhere. People who are living, whether it's like agricultural lifestyles or just lifestyles and careers where they're more embodied, you know, I guess less disembodied than the people in cities by nature of how their daily lives look. I think that's a big part of it, but yeah, it's interesting to think about Chinese medicine specifically and like some of the underlying value systems of that culture, which doesn't get focused on when we're talking about like drones and mRNA technology and all that.
So, Kenny, you said earlier and asked earlier, is the Chinese ruling class afraid? And I think that's probably that question kind of crystallized for me at least one way of looking at some of the differences that exist between, for me, when I talk about these two nations in competition in a global capitalist system versus other people like the Corbett report. I thought had a pretty good take on the protests, saying we support the protests. We probably recognize that to some level the U.S. is going to get its fingers in. And I felt like it was pretty nuanced in how they talked about the protests in China. But at the end of the day, I think their way of looking at it is that the Chinese ruling class and the U.S. ruling class are united in playing a game, a good cop, bad cop game on the global international working class. Like that is almost like China has agreed to be this bad cop to allow the rulers in Europe and the United States to breathe a little more easily as they clamp down on their population. So they see it. They again see this in a framework of collaboration, largely supporting the protests, but also saying that that what's happening right here is problem, reaction, solution. Again, and that's where I disagree. I do think that this is a result of that. I do believe the Chinese ruling class is afraid. And I think they've had problems in their economy. There's been issues of housing bubble that I've heard about, and banks, being essentially there's run on banks in China. So I think not as all well with the Chinese economy, and I think that they themselves are concerned about what they're going to have to do to crack down. But that is also true here in the United States. So when we talk about robot dogs, or not, they're not dogs in this case, but when we talk about robots being armed to kill people in San Francisco, and the Board of Supervisors agreeing to that, that is on the heels of Oakland Board of Supervisors not approving of robots being given live shotgun rounds to shoot at people. They didn't approve it yet, kind of thing. And at the same time, Britain has in the very same breath where they're doing their criticisms of the Chinese and their authoritarianism. They have passed a set of rules. Let me see if I can find it. Called the Social Disruption Prevention Orders, which basically say that the British government, without any basis, can say, if we think your protesting is going to get in our way, we can issue a ban on you going to a protest. And if you choose to go to a protest, you can be subject to fine, to prison. You can be put with a 24/7 GPS monitor, and we can stop and search you without any reasonable cause. And so Britain has passed, at the very same time when they were doing all this prime minister swaps, passed a series of laws that basically made it much more easier for the police force to crack down on protests. So all the ruling classes know that they have a hurdle to go over in the coming years as it relates to climate lockdowns or energy lockdowns or COVID lockdowns or tridemic. What is it? The triple demic. That's what you're facing in Washington. It's because like RSV, flu, and COVID, they're calling them tridemics. All of them are planning on continuing to control their populations because they're going to be continuing to steal from us. So this plan is global, but I would still say it's a competitive one, not a collaborative one. But there are people who I believe are really worth following who see this as a global collaborative process.
I just have a question. What about this? Do you think there's any sort of fear from the Chinese government that, of a chemical or like of expecting an attack. I'm just wondering, right? Is there any possibility that they are preparing their populations? I'm just being wildly conspirational here. Is there any notion that they're preparing their populations for future warfare with these vaccines? In like, is China paranoid? Is there any sort of, do you see any sort of traction to that notion that China might be paranoid of the West, attacking them, and that's why they're being so, severe in their handling of COVID?
You talking about with the vaccines in particular? Like they're trying to.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there's any traction to this idea. I'm not sure. I'm just wondering if China has any merits to be paranoid on a virus warfare type of shit.
I would say that both China and the United States and Russia, when they talk about being fearful of another country using biological weapons, they are all saying that with the understanding that they are developing offensive biological weapons. That's number one. Number two, the U.S. has a super soldier program, super soldier, cyborg soldier 2050, that is predicated on what's already being developed in China and France, actually. So when I think about mRNA technologies, and I think one of the vaccines, so-called, one of the shots that the Chinese is using is not mRNA based, but double-stranded DNA. So it is a gene therapy technology. All of these are with the understanding that they are experimenting on the populations to develop ways to place genes inside of the human genome and produce outcomes that will make people less subject to pain, more stronger. All those things that we talked about that the U.S. is trying to do to create super soldiers. They're all basically, the U.S. is complaining that China is ahead of them on that.
Transhumans, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's far more about. I think I get what you're asking, but I think it's more about governments experimenting on their own. I mean, waging biological warfare, really, in a way, on their own populations. In order, and I think there's a myriad of different goals and potential outcomes there, but yeah, I think the ultimate goal is creating transhumans, as crazy as that sounds. The real transhumans. Other transhumans.
I have something that's related that I'd like to share, that I think it's I was looking up something right now about something I had heard on a podcast that I can't find it right now. So if I find it, I'll share it, about how much the push for this confinement and to be at home is to also habituate people to work from home, to work virtually, to get people. But I couldn't find it was a mainstream article. So here, as I was searching, the connection of all this, right? Like people being at home. This is the kind of stuff that I feel is being pushed onto us more and more, just working virtually, working more from home, trying to get us to work online. And that made me think a lot about, I shared with Workers and Students for Choice about how this week I had a meeting with my nephew's teacher, and the issue of tech was brought up, and it was about the use of tech, and I had said, well, what kind of tech is being used? Because I feel like he's coming home and he's talking about apps, and we never let him be on apps, and he's never on the screen unless it's a certain program, something we haven't watched from old times. Like we haven't watched something that's a little bit more of what we're okay with, but he's not interactive with the screen, and he's coming home. So what are you doing? And his teacher said that they're using some sites, and one of them, so I don't talk about the whole conference that I had, one of them is Pixton. And Pixton is online, create avatars, and you can start learning and meet your teacher creating these avatars that you could use, that it's supposed to enhance, it's supposed to motivate, it's supposed to build literacy, and it's this kind of educational, just all healthy kind of thing that you're supposed to use. It's not, it's safe for students to use, has a privacy student pledge thing, like everything that that a parent, I guess, wants to hear. But this is using, these are like using avatars that you can use with different genders, different colors of skin, different ways of creating this avatar, that it just is like a push for the future of where we're going to live in, which is the metaverse, you know? So all of these confinements and the pushing for isolation and for us to just basically plug in, that's what this is going to lead to. And these confinements are for that. We're just going to be on VR sets and haptic suits and that world, and training our students from, my nephew is 7, and training them from this age to learn how to use these avatars. So I'm concerned, right? Like, I'm really concerned. And I said, I don't want this to be used. And my brother Jonathan, he's also like, no, this isn't something we want. But how do we then? And I said, like, the school should be a sanctuary, should be a place of refuge for not using this tech. And here we are, as an educator, I said, like, you're doing what parents are doing, and what many years ago we used to say before 2020. There's an issue of a lot of tech being used at home, and here suddenly that isn't an issue anymore. It used to be said by the World Health Organization, I remember clearly, that it should be limited. Young children should be limited less than 40 minutes, and depending on the age, it went lower and lower. And suddenly, no one discusses that. No one cares about that. So it is something that's present for me. And as I think about the people who are being confined, what are you supposed to do in China or here, or when you were in Australia and you were locked up, or in New Zealand or in Italy? What were you supposed to do? Even here in the USA, you get online and you get hooked up and you watch more porn and you get on more apps and you start playing more games and you start creating avatars and you start, like, it's like it's an addiction to, and it's only exacerbated by being isolated, right? So this is what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, as many people as may have been protesting in China, like, I will say, like, I asked several of my students who are from China, like, have you heard anything? What are your families back home saying? I asked my partner who has friends and connections in China. Everyone's like, yeah, I heard there were some protests. Like, I have to assume the majority of people are plugged in. It's the same as here. Like, a lot of people didn't even know that there was resistance going on, It's like, oh, news to me. Like, I was just working from home, just same old. It's hard to know. It's hard to gauge. Like, everybody has their sphere.
And when you are plugged in, it's going to be very crafted what you can or cannot receive, what information you have, once we're all.
Yeah, but I think we're guilty of that too. Like, and independent media is certainly guilty of that too. So it can be tricky. Like,
yeah,
to really get a real pulse on whether it's here or China or Australia or wherever.
Yeah, I think we had picture day at our school, and students were pretty much, I don't know, forced, but they ultimately all were asked, and I think all chose to remove their masks to take their picture at school. But they were like, it was frightening for them, and they were like very quick to get those masks back on. And it was not because they were worried about COVID running around in the air.
Right.
The students talk about it now, about doing their reveal. Like, now students say, when are you going to do your reveal? Like, that's how they now think of it. So what I see, and I'm going to go back to Jessica's statement of war, the war on us. These masks are a destruction of the human identity, so that people will feel imprisoned by this visage and look for freedom in another area where they feel like they are free to put on all sorts of pictures of themselves, so that freedom feels like Avatar, because this thing feels like a prison. And that is the game here. And it's working, unfortunately. And the Avatar is a deeper prison, with the feeling of, oh, I can be anyone. I don't have to be afraid of revealing. In fact, I can be more myself in this three-dimensional space and on a ones and zeros than I am now, particularly when you have facial recognition software, which is going to restrict you from going. So your face is going to be your prison, because it's going to be, you're going to, based on what that your face says to the screen, that's going to be whether you do get in or don't get in. And you only get in if you comply. So if your face doesn't comply, then no. So it's this is a war operation on our minds and on our freedoms that is happening exactly right now. And it's not just miseducation. It's not just, wait, what are they doing? This is a declaration of war, and we have not understood it as such. And that's why I think the people we've interviewed last week who are doing the schools that understand that they're not about masking, but they're about getting rid of that tech. And they understand that this project that is against us is just at the beginning of its attack on us. That is when we are talking about our freedom schools, you are going to have that level of conception of, at least, of the understanding of what we're facing, I feel, to properly begin to construct alternative institutions. Because a lot of these other freedom schools that are talking about how do we still use tech, it's a trap.
Yeah, and I think just on the digital ID, bank account thing, I don't think nearly enough emphasis or recognition has been placed on what happened with those truckers' bank accounts. Even as psyopy and performative as all this stupid Kanye stuff has been lately, again, bank accounts? You're freezing bank accounts because of stuff people said, or because they protested peacefully against the government. If you think China's bad, no, it's happening here. And yeah, and I we've seen a kind of uptick, at least on campus, not so much in town, but with the masks the past couple weeks, a lot of people have been wearing them to meetings and stuff, and it's still so disturbing to me. But it's not really any different, or maybe it's even not as bad as the tech stuff. I was reading one of my students prose poems that he wrote, and it was actually a really cool piece, but it was really disturbing thinking about all of this stuff, because it was written it was through the lens of Snapchat, and it was all about growing up in front of a Snapchat camera, right? And this, and he wrote it from the perspective of Snapchat. So Snapchat witnessing, puberty, growing a beard, Snapchat witnessing his first girlfriend, Snapchat witnessing him retake all these photos, right, out of insecurity of how he looked, stuff like that. And it captured all of it. It captured his entire life, his entire upbringing, basically. That is scary. That's just another version of the mask, right?
Talk about the Truman Show.
Yeah.
Jim Carrey.
I think at this point, everyone in the world, or most people in the world, have gotten a taste of, living under a state of an emergency. And, I think seeding that memory, it will be very important for, the people who want to rule this world, who understand, that scaring people, making them scared of the world, of each other, that is a powerful tool, to drive fear into people. And it infuriates me of, again, these kids, right? Because they know they're going to be the ones who are going to really live in this world. We are half in, half out. You know, we've experienced the world both ways, and so these kids, they don't know, you know, a world beyond the iPhone. Most kids in school now, you know, and so it's just terrifying, right? And that's why it's so important, like you said, Libson, for those create those alternatives, you know, institutions, educational tools, things, you know, like of community, of socializing that are outside of all this tech normalcy, you know, that is more prevalent in cities. You know, it's everywhere, but it is more prevalent in cities. And so that's why it's no surprise to me when, Jessica, you point out that rural areas tend to, you know, have more resistance. And it makes sense. You know, they have a more of an, you know, a hold on reality, on the material reality of things, biology, you know, their own humanity, really. You know, not that it's perfect, but if anything, like, to me, that is what I need to look for. You know, like the more rural type of way of living. You know, that it's scary for people trapped in the cities, honestly, because I just moved to a rural area, and my life, as even though I haven't been working, I've gotten support. I'm not gonna pretend like I've done this alone, but my life, like, I didn't realize how much of a trap, how trapped I was in my mind by just staying in San Francisco, you know, and you know, like seeing buildings as, you know, like the horizon, you know, instead of like the actual, you know, world and nature and, you know, the mountains.
Quiet? Like, what is that?
You know, and again, it's not perfect, because I think people understand this is gonna go everywhere. It's going everywhere. You know, and I think that's the part, right? That's what we talk about class warfare, right? Because it is a war. This was a huge blow, and we have to recognize it as such. I think that it's not the first one. It's not. It's probably the latest and biggest one. But, you know, like, and even this technological process, as Jake has talked about, didn't start right now. That didn't start with the iPhone. You know, but we do have to re-examine, right, like our relationship to things, because, like, technology is part of our lives. It's just like you asked in the other episode, Jessica, who benefits? What is the benefit? You know, and who has control of it?
So before we end, I want to just, because this is the adopted city that I have. Like, even though I went to school, like, obviously I feel more connected because of my family to Mexico and to the countryside. And I remember my long 6 months of being in Mexico and 6 months here, and just my love of the river and my great grandfather's village. I still love San Francisco, and I feel this attack on San Francisco from everybody. I just want to say, like, I understand reasons. Like, I also feel I've expressed the difficulties it is to be in this city because of the liberal ideology and so much hypocrisy, as we have just talked about. Like, for example, all of the praising that went to China, and suddenly all of the criticism that's going to China, and who the like crap understands these people that, like. But I I have this affection for the city. I get what Kenny is saying. I get that. In Andy, you live in Oakland, where you're kind of out there with two redwood trees, and you know, it's like a beautiful part of where I visited your house. I know what it's like. You know, I envy you over there, and I'm here packed in with other homes, and I try to make a refuge here with my neighbors. Uh, but I would love to go live somewhere isolated in Canada or in a rural part of Mexico. Unfortunately, I think it's being consumed up by like all this construction that's happening, that's trying to have this connection between Mexico City and the Yucatan, so people can have tourists take this train. And I I just I just think the fight has to be done. Personally, me, I know that it could be mental challenge, and like it's a but the fight has to be done with working class people that where cities are, and this people come to the city, right? Like they come here to find jobs and stuff, and that's why I don't give up on public education. And I've also the criticism on public education. Maybe I'm just an idealist in that, like staying here in the city, not letting it be overrun by more gentrification, by more people who are trying to overtake the city. I understand it. And also public education. I don't know why I feel so defensive about it. It's just my love for the real people that attend the public schools. And at the same time, I love what JD and Jay are doing, you know, and I wish that the kids and the families I work with would have that experience. I really do. I really, really do. And if I leave SF, I feel as if I leave my community of neighbors and the people I've grown up here with, and they love how weird I am and how I hand over produce for them. Like I just give them some of the ¿cómo se dice? Rizado, the kale over to my neighbor, and it just feels to me like I would abandon them, and I want to stay here and be the unvaccinated, anarchist that's against COVID lockdowns and still be here for them.
Well, I think we need soldiers everywhere. So
Yes.
I don't think you have to end staying. I will say long term, I mean, this gets into more of like the ecological deep green resistance type of vibes, but like cities can't exist without like outsourcing all that labor and essentially stealing and exploiting resources and food supply and all that stuff from rural areas. So I don't like long term, I think they have to go. But short term, that's where a lot of people are. And like what we always come back to, like nobody's dispensable. Like that's the totalitarian oppressor mindset, right? Is like, oh yeah, well we can just experiment on these people and some of them will die, most of them will get sick or have a reduced quality of life or whatever, and it's just collateral damage. But that's not our position.
Just to go back, I love San Francisco as much as you do. In many ways, I've had so many memories there. But the people that I have deep connections with, it's done. Like San Francisco for me, like and I don't know if you want to include this, but you and your family have a home there. My family is struggling to stay there. We don't.
I understand.
And so I've been forced to migrate. That's the human history, right? Like, in the people that I see that rule the city, that overrun the city, that really have the more connected to this system, right? That is taking over the world. And this that mentality that dominates the conversations. It's absolutely pockets of resistance, and that's the community I was part of. But even in those communities, a lot of those people that think they're doing well for their community, they're connected to that fucking matrix, and they don't think they are, but they're deeply connected, and their power resides on that. And so and at the end of the day, that's the other thing about fighting, right? Like, yes, you have to fight, and I will continue to fight, but it's also my survival, my immediate survival, my sanity. We all have to balance this stuff, right? And so I would love, if I had a piece of San Francisco where I could stake my ground, but I don't have that. I've been bullied out.
Well, and what do you really love about it, Eduardo? I mean, it's the people, it's the land itself, it's the community. It's not like the fact that it's a city like that is just
no,
you're
you know right.
What I mean? Like, and I agree, like with you and I mean, all of us, like we all have memories, and for me, it's like probably Portland and New York, like those places, which ironically have been like, some of the biggest like liberal holdouts, like San Francisco, like those still are magical places to me.
course.
But not
yeah.
by nature of being cities. It's because of like
Right.
my life there, right?
We've digressed too much. So let's get back on topic. It's getting late. It's 8:21. So I think that I don't have anything else to add to this on China and the protest. Does anyone else have something else to add? That was a lovely discussion, and thank you for suggesting it, Andy. Let's conclude. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog as what'sleftpodcast.com. Right? You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on iTunes Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. And you can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes where we found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca. You can also find our social media handles as in the episode notes as at Don Eduardo Barca and at ZeptiKE on Instagram, and Jess's Twitter handle as jhomie89. Andy.
Just to say, and I don't know if this is going to mean anything. Currently, we are not. This last episode we did is not showing up on iTunes and Spotify. I don't think it's a censorship thing. It seems like we have a problem with our feed, the blog feed that we're starting from. So I'm not sure what's going on, but our last episode is not on iTunes or Spotify because it's not being updated somehow from the blog that I put it on that normally has been updating. So I don't know what's going on. But if you have come onto YouTube, I personally think the best way to be able to listen to it instead of watch it is to get onto that what'sleftpodcast.com. That's going to be the most reliable way.
The most reliable way, right? What'sleftpodcast.com. Thanks. All right, well, that concludes. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-hosts Jessica Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipson. We'll check us out, and we'll see you all later next time. Ciao.